Now to open the case of the opposition, it gives me great pleasure to call on Renit. It's not right. You think it's Renit? Right.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to refute, to begin my speech, three key issues brought up by the proposition here. And the first is, the proposition state in his brief point that religion is important. It has enormous influence and therefore it should have regulations imposed on it. It should have checks and balances. And in response to that, I would like to say we concede entirely. We absolutely agree. We believe that regulation is critical in religious rhetoric so that it doesn't include things like racism, so that it doesn't include things like incitement to violence. And all of these things require regulation. I'm going to address that exactly in my second point today. Why banning all missionary work will encourage religious rhetoric that is not within the public eye, that is not within the view of the government and those that impose those checks and balances. But I'll come to that presently. The second point that the opposition brought up today was the status quo in Israel is discriminatory. And again, we're not going to discuss the status quo in Israel today and exactly what it allows and disallows, but if it is discriminatory, we say, well then, allow all missionaryism in Israel entirely, and therefore it is not going to be discriminatory. There we go. And in regards to their second point about discrimination, that those movements that don't have a lot of financial support will be less persuasive, we say, why not regulate funding of missionaries? Doesn't that eliminate this kind of financial advantage? So what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen, is we can very easily limit funding, just like we have very transparent understanding of funding in political campaigns and political lobbies. We should have very transparent understanding of funding in missionaryism, but that is not the point of today's debate. The third point that we spoke about today, that the proposition spoke about today, is that missionary work makes people angry and it stirs up conflict. And again, I'd like to say that I'll refer you to the point that I'm going to bring up later in my speech, is that discourse can be much more violent, much more vitriolic, and much more dangerous if it goes into what I'm going to term the black market of the ideas. So, I'm going to talk about three things today. The first thing I'm going to talk about is freedom of speech. The second thing I'm going to talk about is underground religious movements and underground movements of missionaries. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is fluidity of opinions and ideas. So firstly, freedom of speech. Well, why do we have freedom of speech? Well, we believe that freedom of speech allows people to endeavour to work for the kind of society that they want to live in. And in this regard, ladies and gentlemen, I'll point you to the fact that religion is not just about God or what you believe that God, whether you believe He created the universe or whether you believe He likes you or not. Religion is also about a set of beliefs and a set of values. You have many people, for example, who are religiously or what is considered religiously observant, who don't actually believe in a big father figure on a chair, who believe in a set of ideals, a set of values, a way in which they want their society to be run, and it helps them to create the kind of society that they want to live in. I'm going to give you a simple example and a more complex example. The simple example is that when you can use religion as something to say to people, you know, religion is the opiate of the masses. Well, we think that God will be very angry at you if you steal. We think that God will be very angry at you if you kill. This is an incredibly powerful tool for people to create the kind of society that they want to live in. But here's a more subtle example. I'll just take you in 1 minute. A more subtle example is in the case of Judaism. Those who keep kosher are prohibited from eating certain things that involve cruelty to animals. And in that regard, I might say that I believe that I would like to work for a society in which eating lobster is absolutely illegal. It's against the law because it's against the beliefs and values that I hold, because lobsters go into boiling hot water and they die a terrible, horrible death. So again, what I want to reiterate is that freedom of speech allows people to work for the kind of society in which they would like to live. Yes, sir? That's precisely why it's important that these societies with their values are not undermined by the poisonous work of the missionaries. I'm going to come to that exactly in my next point. And then my next point here is about underground movements. Now, what happens to a religious fanatic when you tell him he can no longer propagate the word of God? I don't think he's going to say, okay, Mr. Prime Minister, you've said it's illegal and now I'm going to stop. What's going to happen realistically, ladies and gentlemen? The moderates, who have respect for the law of the land in which they live, are going to follow the law, and they're not going to missionize, because they are somewhat more involved in secular society and don't necessarily want to transgress its laws. But extremists are not necessarily going to agree with that. And what we're going to have as a result of that is missionary work that is conducted away from the eye of the government, away from regulation, and away from a sphere in which we can say, no, that's incitement to violence, that's against the law. No, that's incitement to racism, etc. We're going to move missionary work away from the public eye in a very, very dangerous way. Another thing that will do, ladies and gentlemen, is that will isolate extremists. And it will allow this kind of snowball effect in which the extremist community is no longer moderated by those who also would like to work within secular society. And we see very often that when we isolate fanatic communities, they have a way of snowballing this kind of fanatic effect. So the third thing that I want to discuss... yes, sir.
This is a completely generic black market argument. Why can that logic not be applied to incitement? Why should we not allow incitement according to that very logic?
We don't allow incitement to violence, and it's true that the black market idea is generic, but perhaps you might consider the fact that it is generic because it's absolutely true. In many cases, we need to make a decision about whether we want something above board or whether we're happy for it to happen behind our eyes necessarily. And I think that in this case, we can talk about missionary work that is regulated. For example, the kinds of institutions, like the religious institutions that do teach, that do, have young people come to them and live with them, etc., are not underground regulations. They are not underground institutions. So people can come into those institutions, people can access the information that is being distributed by those institutions, and we don't want to take that away from our governments. The third thing I just want to briefly touch upon, and Molly will expand upon this, is that if we do not allow missionary work, missionary activity tries to propagate an opinion. Now, whether or not you necessarily think that that opinion is a better one or a worse one, if we do not allow this to happen, people are going to be, to a certain extent, enslaved to the opinions that they have always held, either by chance or because they grew up like that in their families, etc. So what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is by allowing missionaryism anywhere, everywhere, we'll just go with that. What we're talking about is allowing the fluidity of ideas in the free marketplace of ideas, and allowing those who think that their ideas are important, who think that their ideas are better, who are passionate about their ideas, to speak those ideas. Okay, not necessarily those who don't really care either way to not say anything, and of course you can move to atheism if you desire, but it's not necessarily something that is going to happen. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've told you today that we believe that that in freedom of speech, we believe in the importance of regulating missionary work and the impossibility of doing that outside of banning, and we believe in the fluidity of ideas and opinions. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Renette for her speech, and now call